She was 61 years old, her hair silver at the temples, her hands calloused in ways that no desk job ever produces, and every single person on that firing line thought she was someone's lost grandmother who had wandered past the wrong security checkpoint. They were laughing before she even touched the rifle. That was their first mistake. The second was letting Staff Sergeant Derek Voss say what he said into a live microphone in front of a general, 2 foreign military observers, and 43 soldiers who were about to watch the most embarrassing professional moment of his career unfold in slow motion. Because the woman standing beside that Barrett rifle wasn't confused. She wasn't lost. She was reading every single one of them. The wind, the distance, the angle, the arrogance, and she had already calculated how this was going to end. If this story already has you hooked, I want to invite you to follow along all the way to the end, because what happens next is something none of them saw coming. Hit subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Redstone Tactical Training Center sat on 47,000 acres of Arizona desert, and on a Tuesday morning in late October, it smelled like burnt cordite, dry dust, and the particular kind of institutional tension that builds when military reputations are on the line. The sky was the color of old denim, the kind of overcast that flattens light and makes long-range visibility deceptively clean. Range 7 was the largest open-fire demonstration corridor on the base, built specifically for high-value evaluations, the kind attended by brass, contractors, foreign liaisons, and the occasional congressional observer who didn't know what they were looking at, but nodded seriously anyway. Today's audience included Brigadier General Nathan Wallace, who stood near the observer's platform with his arms crossed and his expression neutral in the particular way of men who had learned that visible reactions were a form of vulnerability. Beside him stood Colonel Patricia Drummond, who was nominally in charge of the day's evaluation schedule, and 2 uniformed representatives from an allied nation's Special Operations Command, whose names had been distributed in a briefing document that at least half the soldiers present had not fully read. There was also a small cluster of civilian contractors positioned slightly apart from the military contingent, wearing the laminated badges and tactical adjacent clothing of people who sold equipment to governments and preferred to look like they might use it. Mara Whitmore was among the civilians, and she did not belong to any contractor group. She had arrived that morning in a gray compact rental car that she had parked in Lot C without asking for the closer spaces. She wore dark trousers, a long-sleeved shirt in olive drab, and a field jacket that was old enough to have earned its fading. She carried a single bag. She had signed in at the visitor checkpoint without incident, collected her badge, and walked to Range 7 with the unhurried gait of someone who had seen ranges like this one so many times that the scale no longer impressed her. She was 61. She had gray threading through brown hair she kept cut short. There were lines around her eyes that came from squinting through optics in conditions that were either too bright or too dark, and a scar along her left jawline that she had stopped explaining decades ago. She was not a large woman. She was not a physically intimidating woman in any way that read as immediately obvious. She stood near the equipment display tables and studied the Barrett M107A1 laid out on the bench in front of her the way a cardiologist studies an EKG, not impressed, not alarmed, simply reading it. That was when Sergeant Derek Voss noticed her. Voss was 34, a decorated long-range marksman who had deployed 3 times and come back with commendations each time. He was legitimately good at his job. He was also the kind of good that had curdled slightly into certainty, the kind of man who had been told he was exceptional often enough that he had stopped being curious about what exceptional actually required. He wore his skill like a rank insignia, visibly, so that others would not forget to notice it. He was scheduled to lead the demonstration of the new Barrett's capabilities at ranges exceeding 3,000 meters, which was the centerpiece of the evaluation, and he had prepared thoroughly. He had run the ballistic calculations. He had studied the wind charts for this range on this morning. He had zeroed the rifle 2 days prior and confirmed with the digital targeting system integrated into the platform. When he walked toward the equipment table and saw Mara standing beside the rifle, he stopped. "Ma'am." His voice was polite in the way that is a thin coating over something less polite. "Civilians aren't supposed to be this close to the equipment during setup." Mara looked up at him. Her expression did not change. I was asked to evaluate the platform. You're evaluating the Barrett? The integration system, specifically. The ballistic calculator software. I consulted on the earlier version. She said this simply, without emphasis, and went back to looking at the rifle. Voss looked at her for a moment. The gray hair, the age, the civilian jacket, and made a decision that he would spend the next 3 months regretting. With respect, he said, loud enough that 2 nearby soldiers turned, this isn't the kind of system you learn from a consulting contract. The field calibration on these platforms requires actual shooting experience in real conditions. He paused. Not, he gestured vaguely at her, theoretical expertise. Mara looked up again. This time she held his eyes for exactly 1 second. Noted, she said, and turned back to the rifle. One of the soldiers near the barrier, a specialist named Graves, 22 years old and 6 weeks out of advanced individual training, made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but close enough that the 2 soldiers beside him caught it and exchanged a look. Voss moved to his position at the line, and the demonstration began. General Wallace had heard the exchange from 12 feet away. He did not react to it. He filed it. The demonstration's first segment covered the rifle's technical specifications, which Voss delivered with practiced fluency. He was good at this part. The setup, the explanation, the performance of authority that comes from clearly knowing your material. The soldiers watched him with the focused attention of people who understood they were being evaluated indirectly by how well they attended to an evaluation. The foreign observers took careful notes. Colonel Drummond checked items off a list. Mara stood apart from the group and watched Voss at the firing position. She was not watching him the way the other observers watched him, as a performance to be assessed. She was watching him the way someone reads a text in a language they know better than the speaker does. Her eyes moved from his positioning to the rifle's angle, to the distant target markers, to the grass line along the eastern berm where the wind was doing something specific and intermittent that the digital sensors on the platform were not currently capturing. The primary demonstration target was set at 2,000 meters. Voss hit it on his first shot, which earned the appropriate response. Not applause, because this was a professional evaluation, but a general sense of collective acknowledgement that the first box had been checked. The second target, at 2,400 meters, he hit on the first shot as well. The digital system was performing well. The integration software was displaying compensated firing solutions within acceptable margins. Everything was going as prepared. Then they moved to the secondary target. The secondary target was the one that mattered to everyone in the room with the clearance to know what the evaluation was actually for. It was a steel plate, roughly the size of a vehicle door, positioned at 3,200 meters. At that distance, the naked eye couldn't confirm a hit in real time. You needed the sensors, the cameras, and the ballistic feedback display that showed point-of-impact data within 3 seconds of the shot. 3,200 meters was not impossible, but it was the kind of distance where the margin for error compressed to almost nothing, where environmental factors that were negligible at shorter ranges became decisive, and where a marksman's read on conditions, not just their ballistic data, determined whether the round went where it was supposed to go. Voss settled at the firing line. He studied the digital display. He made the adjustments the system recommended. He exhaled, steadied, and fired. The 3-second wait for impact data felt longer than it was. The display read, miss, impact 0.4 meters high, 0.2 meters left. There was a silence that had a specific texture to it, the kind that forms around a moment nobody was quite expecting. Voss reset. He made additional adjustments. He checked the wind data on the display. He fired again. Misses. Impact 0.6 meters high, 0.3 meters left. The pattern was consistent, which meant the error was systematic. Something in either the environmental read or the ballistic compensation was wrong in a way that was repeating. General Wallace uncrossed his arms. This was not an aggressive gesture. It was a noticing gesture. Voss stood up from the firing position. He kept his face controlled, but control isn't the same as calm, and the people who knew what calm looked like could tell the difference. He looked at the display data. He looked at the wind sensors. He looked at the range in the particular way of a man trying to diagnose a problem he wasn't expecting to have in front of an audience. He could not afford to disappoint. Technical issue with the integration feed? Colonel Drummond asked, and her voice was careful and neutral and unhelpful. Possibly, Voss said it flatly. He wasn't sure. Specialist Graves, standing near the barrier, was not laughing now. What happened next, Mara did not initiate. Voss turned toward the observer group. He may have been looking for an exit from the situation. He may have been looking for a technical officer to redirect attention toward. What he found was Mara Whitmore standing 15 feet away, not looking at him, looking at the grass line along the eastern berm where the wind had been doing its intermittent thing for the past 20 minutes. You had something to say earlier about the system, he said. There was an edge in it, not quite confrontational, but close. The kind of thing that was technically a question and functionally a challenge. About theoretical expertise. Mara looked at him. If you think you know what the system is missing, Voss continued, this would be the time. He gestured toward the firing position. The gesture was not gracious. It was the gesture of a man who expected her to decline and wanted the group to watch her decline. Some of the soldiers shifted. It was subtle, the small physical language of people recalibrating expectations. This was either going to be awkward or it was going to be something else entirely. General Wallace said, "Sergeant." Voss stopped. Wallace looked at him for a moment, then looked at Mara. "Ms. Whitmore." His voice was even. "Would you like to take the shot?" Something moved through the group. Not a sound exactly, more a collective change in barometric pressure. The foreign observers looked at each other. Colonel Drummond looked at Wallace. Voss looked at Wallace with an expression that was making a very focused effort not to be what it was. Mara said, "Yes." She walked to the firing position without hurrying. She set down her bag beside the bench, pulled on her gloves, worn leather shooting gloves, old, fitted to her hands from years of use, and looked at the rifle for a moment before touching it. Then she crouched slightly and examined the platform's mounting points. She moved to the left and looked at the angle of the barrel relative to the ground surface. She straightened and looked east, not at the target, at the berm. "What's the read on wind at the 500-meter mark?" she asked. One of the range technicians checked the sensor display. 4.2 knots, bearing 275. "What about at 1,200 meters?" A pause. The tech checked. Sensors showing 3.8. Mara nodded once, to herself, not to anyone in particular. She looked at the grass again. The way it moved was specific. There was a pattern to the intermittency, a rhythm to the gust timing that the static sensor data was not representing. She settled at the firing position. She did not use the integrated ballistic display. She moved the turrets manually, making adjustments with the deliberate precision of someone solving a known equation. She wasn't going fast, but she wasn't hesitating either. She was simply proceeding at the pace that the task required. "She's not using the system," Graves said quietly to the soldier beside him. "I can see that," the soldier said. Voss stood with his arms at his sides, watching her. His face had moved past the controlled expression into something flatter, harder to read. Mara put her eye to the scope. She watched. She was not watching the target. She was watching the grass, the air above the berm, the specific way the thermal distortion above the desert floor was moving in relation to the wind. She was reading something that existed only in the interaction between every variable present, a calculation that no sensor array had been built to capture because it required knowing not just the data points, but what the data points meant when they happened in that particular sequence. 22 seconds passed. She fired. 3 seconds. The display read, "Hit. Center mass, deviation 0.04 meters. The number was so small that Specialist Graves actually read it twice. Nobody moved for a moment. The range held the particular silence of a group of people processing something that has just fallen outside their prepared frameworks. The foreign observers were very still. Colonel Drummond had stopped checking her list. General Wallace was looking at Mara with an expression that was no longer neutral. It was alert, precise, and pointed at something specific. "That's," one of the contractors started, then stopped. Voss was looking at the display. He hadn't moved from where he was standing. The expression on his face now was not anger, not embarrassment, not the controlled professionalism he'd been maintaining. It was something simpler and harder. He was genuinely processing what he had just witnessed, and his previous certainties were not fitting cleanly around it. Mara straightened up from the firing position. She removed her gloves, folded them, and put them in her jacket pocket. She looked at the display once, not triumphantly, just confirming, and then she looked at the grass line along the eastern berm, because there was one more gust pattern she'd been tracking and she wanted to see if she'd read it correctly. She had. General Wallace walked toward her. He moved with the unhurried deliberateness of someone who has stopped performing authority because he no longer needs to. It's simply what he is. He stopped 3 feet away and looked at her jacket. Not her face. Her jacket. On the left chest, beneath the outer lapel fold that had been sitting against her ribs all morning, there was an insignia, small, silver, and black. A designation that didn't appear on any current service uniform because it belonged to a program that had been declassified only 6 years ago, and before that had existed under a name that appeared in exactly 3 documents, all of which were still restricted above the clearance level of everyone present except one person. Wallace said quietly, "When did you retire?" 4 years ago. Mara's voice was the same as it had been all morning, even unhurried, not performing anything. From? She said the designation aloud. It was a series of numbers in a letter that meant nothing to most people in the world and meant everything to the people who knew what to listen for. Wallace nodded. Tier 1. Instructor, the last 12 years. He looked at her for a moment. You wrote the long-range qualification standard. The revised version, 78 to 3,200 meters, yes. Wallace turned. He looked at Sergeant Voss. And then, in a voice that did not need to be loud to reach every person on range 7, he said, Sergeant Voss, the drill you failed this morning was drawn from curriculum you were trained on. I'd like you to tell me who you think wrote it. The silence that followed was the kind that does not have an exit. Voss looked at Mara. His face went through something, a rapid private recalibration, and landed somewhere that was not quite recognition and not quite shame, but contained elements of both. His jaw worked once. He said nothing. Written by Mara Whitmore, Wallace said, still looking at Voss. In 2009. Updated twice since, most recently 2018. The training doctrine you have been executing for 7 years was authored by the woman you asked to step back from the equipment. Specialist Graves made a sound that he turned immediately into a cough. One of the foreign observers leaned toward his colleague and said something quietly in their language. Whatever it was, his colleague replied with a short word and a nod that suggested it had been what he was already thinking. Mara was not watching Voss. She had turned back to the rifle and was examining something on the platform mounting that had been bothering her since she first looked at it. A microfracture in the rail attachment point, hairline thin, visible only if you knew what you were looking at. It had nothing to do with today's shots. It would matter on the next 1,000. She was already writing the note in her head. That was the thing none of them fully understood yet. Standing there in the flattening October light with the smell of cordite and desert and the particular stunned quiet of people whose assumptions have just been publicly disassembled, Mara Whitmore was not thinking about what she had proven. She was already thinking about the next problem that needed solving. She pulled a pen from her jacket pocket and began writing on the notepad clipped to the evaluation board beside the bench. Wallace watched her for a moment. Then he turned to Colonel Drummond. Restructure the remainder of the evaluation schedule. I want Ms. Whitmore's assessment of the full platform integration, not just the ballistic software. Sir. Drummond made a note. And Drummond, flag the rail attachment on Unit 3. I believe there's a structural concern she's already identified. Drummond looked at the rifle, then at Mara's pen moving across the notepad. Yes, sir. Voss was still standing where he had been. He had not moved. He was watching Mara write. Not with anger now, not with the performance of control. He was watching the way she held the pen, the angle of her wrist, the specific focused quality of her attention that was entirely separate from the audience around her. He was trying to understand what he was looking at. He had been trying for approximately 6 minutes since the display read center mass with a 0.04 meter deviation, and he was getting somewhere, but he wasn't there yet. One of the soldiers near the barrier, not Graves, an older PFC named Alderman, who had been silent all morning, said quietly to nobody in particular, she already knew about the rail. Nobody answered him, but 2 of the soldiers nodded, almost imperceptibly, the way you nod at something that turns out to be true. Mara finished the note, tore the sheet from the pad and walked it to the range technician. "Cross-check this against the maintenance log for units 2 and 3, she said. "I think you'll find this has been developing for about 60 days. The technician looked at the note, looked at her, looked back at the note. "I'll pull the records." "Thank you." She turned back to the rifle. From across the range, General Wallace was watching her with an expression that had moved past alert into something that was almost satisfaction. The expression of a man who had suspected something true and just, had it confirmed in a way that was better and more specific than he had expected. He would write 3 memos in the next 48 hours. One of them would reach a level of command that had not thought about Mara Whitmore in 4 years, and it would change that. But none of that had happened yet. Right now, on Range 7 at the Redstone Tactical Training Center, it was 10:47 in the morning, the overcast sky was beginning to break toward actual sun, and the spent casing from the impossible shot was lying on the concrete pad beside the firing line where it had ejected. A small thing, brass-colored, ordinary to look at. Graves stared at it for a moment, then looked at the display that still showed 0.04 meters deviation, then looked at the woman who had handed her pen back to the technician and was now crouching beside the rifle's mounting system, examining something that everyone else in the room had walked past without seeing. His radio crackled. His sergeant, not Voss, his direct squad supervisor, told him to return to his position for the secondary evaluation segment. He didn't move immediately. He was watching her hands on the mounting rail, the specific angle of her examination, the way her fingertips pressed along the seam with a precision that looked less like checking and more like listening. He had 3 years in. He had learned things. He was beginning to understand that he had not learned the things he thought he had learned, and that this understanding, uncomfortable as it was, might be the most important thing that happened to him today. His radio crackled again. He walked back to his position. Behind him, Mara Whitmore pressed along the rail seam one more time, found the exact point where the microfracture ended, made a small mark beside it with her pen, and stood. She looked at the range, the distances, the terrain, the way the afternoon light would change the thermal distortion above the desert floor in approximately 90 minutes. She was already thinking 3 hours ahead. She always had been. That was the part they hadn't accounted for. The shot was the visible thing, the thing that would get repeated in briefings and mentioned in memos and discussed at ranges across the country when the evaluation report was circulated. But the shot was not the most dangerous thing about Mara Whitmore. The most dangerous thing was what came before the shot and what came after it, the reading, the assessment, the filing of information that other people hadn't thought to notice. Sergeant Derek Voss, standing at the edge of Range 7 with his arms at his sides and his professional certainty in the process of fundamental revision, did not know yet what his next 6 months were going to look like. He did not know what the general's memo was going to say. He did not know that the rail attachment note Mara had handed the technician was going to reveal a maintenance failure that had been building for 58 days and would have caused a catastrophic malfunction during a live fire exercise scheduled for the following month. He didn't know any of that yet. What he knew in this moment, standing in the flattening October light, was that he had looked at this woman and seen everything except what she actually was. And that was going to cost him. That was going to cost him. The cost arrived sooner than Voss expected. By noon, the evaluation schedule had been restructured in a way that made the original agenda look like a rough draft. General Wallace had not announced any changes with fanfare. He simply told Colonel Drummond what he wanted, and Drummond moved the pieces, and within 40 minutes the afternoon belonged to Mara Whitmore in a way that nobody on Range 7 had anticipated when they signed in that morning. The foreign observers were given an updated briefing summary. The contractor group was politely redirected to a secondary demonstration happening on Range 4, which involved newer optics, and none of the particular tension that had taken root on Range 7, like something growing through concrete. 2 of the contractors left without argument. The third, a broad man named Halloran, who sold integrated targeting systems to 3 governments and had been watching Mara since the shot, lingered near the edge of the platform for an extra 10 minutes before Drummond gave him a look that completed the sentence she wasn't going to say out loud. Voss did not leave. He was not asked to leave, and he was not inclined to go anywhere, because going somewhere would have required him to make a decision about where to put what had just happened, and he wasn't ready for that yet. So he stayed at the edge of Range 7 and watched Mara work through the afternoon portion of the evaluation. Systematic, thorough, unhurried, and he did the thing he had not done that morning, which was pay attention without the overlay of assumption. It was not comfortable, but it was clarifying. Mara's evaluation of the platform integration took 3 hours and 17 minutes. She worked through the digital targeting system, the ballistic calculator, the environmental sensor array, and the mounting hardware with the methodical precision of someone who had helped design the predecessor to all of it, and therefore understood exactly where the updated version had improved and exactly where it had not. She took notes. She asked questions of the range technicians in a way that was specific and direct, not interrogative, but not soft either. She wanted particular information, and she knew how to ask for it. The technician who had taken her maintenance note, a young sergeant named Percival, kept glancing at her with an expression that Voss recognized because he had been wearing a version of it since 10:47 that morning. It was the expression of someone recalibrating. At one point during the late afternoon, Percival pulled the maintenance log for Units 2 and 3 and brought it to Mara. He spread it on the bench beside her without saying anything, and she looked at it for 40 seconds, then pointed to a specific entry dated 56 days prior. "There," she said. "That's when the stress fracture started developing. Whoever did this inspection either didn't know what to look for or looked and wrote it off as within tolerance." Percival studied the entry. "It's marked within tolerance." It was. Barely. The problem is that tolerance measurements on these mounting rails are cumulative, not static. Each firing cycle adds to the stress. She tapped the entry. If someone had flagged this here and recalculated the cumulative load against the projected firing schedule, they would have caught the trajectory. She paused. "How many rounds have Units 2 and 3 put down range since this entry?" Percival did the math on his tablet. His face changed. "About 800 each. And the live fire exercise next month? What's the round count projection?" Another pause. Longer. 400 per unit. In a single session? "Yes, ma'am." Mara straightened. At round 1100 to 1200 on a compromised rail attachment, the failure mode isn't degraded accuracy. It's catastrophic. The platform comes apart. She said it plainly, the way you say something that has a clear mechanical logic to it and no emotional content added. "Pull both units from service until the rails are replaced. Document the inspection failure and flag the tolerance protocol for review. It's missing a cumulative calculation requirement." Percival had already started typing. "Yes, ma'am." From across the range, Colonel Drummond had been close enough to hear the last portion of this exchange. She walked to General Wallace and said something quietly. Wallace's expression did not change, but he nodded once, and Drummond made a note on her tablet that would become a maintenance directive before the end of the business day. Voss was standing 20 feet away. He had heard all of it. He stood there with his arms at his sides and thought about the live fire exercise scheduled for next month, which he was supposed to lead, which involved both Units 2 and 3, which involved 40 soldiers on a line with a piece of equipment that was 1,200 rounds from coming apart under them. He thought about that for a long time. The debrief happened at 16:30 in Conference Room B of the main evaluation building, which was smaller and less formal than its designation suggested. A rectangular room with fluorescent lights and a table that had seen better decades and chairs that were the same chairs that had been there since the building was constructed. Mara sat at the far end of the table with a cup of coffee she had poured herself from the machine in the hallway. Wallace sat to her left. Drummond sat across. A JAG officer named Baxter had appeared, which was new and slightly ominous, and a civilian documentation specialist from the contractor liaison office was present but not participating. Voss was not in the room. He was outside the room. He knew he was outside the room, and he knew why. And he was doing the particular difficult work of standing in a hallway and processing that information without making it into a story about something other than what it was. Inside, the debrief covered Mara's technical findings, the maintenance failure, the integration software's blind spots on crosswind calculation at ranges beyond 2,800 meters, and two separate recommendations she had written out longhand during the afternoon that Drummond was now reading into a recording device for the official transcript. It was thorough and detailed and not about the shot. The shot was not discussed in the debrief because the shot was not the point of the debrief. The shot was already becoming something else, in the particular way that extraordinary moments stop being events and start being reference points. Graves had told 2 people about it by lunchtime. By the time the afternoon evaluation wrapped, 12 soldiers on the base had heard a version of it, and some of those versions were more accurate than others. But all of them contained the number 0.04 and a woman with gray-streaked hair who hadn't used the targeting system. Wallace waited until Drummond finished reading the recommendations before he looked at Mara across the table and said, "The Training Doctrine Review. How long has it been since someone ran a full audit of the long-range qualification standard against current platform capabilities?" Mara drank her coffee. The written standard was last updated 2018. The platforms have changed 3 times since then. So the doctrine is teaching to equipment that's been superseded. In 2 specific areas, yes, the crosswind calculation methodology and the mounting calibration protocol. Both of those sections need to be rewritten for the current generation of hardware. Wallace looked at Drummond. "Who's assigned to doctrine maintenance in long-range qualification?" Drummond checked her tablet. "Currently, nobody. It's flagged for assignment in the next budget cycle." Silence. The particular silence of a room in which the distance between how something should be and how it actually is has just been measured out loud. "When's the next budget cycle, Wallace asked. "March." It was October. Mara said nothing. She was looking at her coffee. "How long would a full rewrite take?" Wallace asked her. "Depends on who's doing it and whether they have access to current field data." A pause. 6 weeks, if it's someone who knows the material. Longer if it's being written from documentation alone. "And if I asked you to do it?" She looked up. "I'm retired." "I'm aware." Another pause, longer than the previous ones. Mara turned the coffee cup in her hands, a small gesture, barely visible, but it was there. "Send me the terms in writing," she said. "I'll look at them." Wallace nodded. "You'll have them by Friday." The hallway outside Conference Room B was beige and unremarkable, and Voss had been standing in it for 45 minutes. He had a cup of coffee that had gone cold and a very specific kind of tension in his shoulders that was not physical fatigue, but rather the tension of a man who has been carrying a wrong assessment of himself and has just realized it is heavy. When Mara came out of the conference room, she almost walked past him. She was reading something on her notepad. She took 4 steps down the hallway before she registered that he was there, and then she stopped. She looked at him. He didn't look the way he had on the range that morning. He looked like a man who had been standing in a hallway for a long time doing something unpleasant but necessary. "Ms. Whitmore." He said it quietly. The hallway was empty except for the 2 of them. "I owe you an apology." Mara looked at him steadily. She didn't say anything. He kept going because stopping would have been worse. "What I said this morning about theoretical expertise was out of line. It was unprofessional, and I said it in front of people, and I shouldn't have said it at all." He paused. "I didn't know who you were. I'm not—" He stopped again, started differently. "That's not actually an excuse. I don't know why I'm trying to make it one." Mara was quiet for a moment, not coldly, just considering him. "Do you know what you missed on that second shot?" she asked. He hesitated. "The crosswind." "The crosswind pattern at the midpoint, specifically. The sensors at 500 and 1200 meters were both underreporting because they're measuring steady-state flow. There was a gust cycle running about every 40 seconds with an 8-second peak that the static measurement was averaging out. Your firing solution was correcting for a wind that wasn't there anymore." Voss absorbed that. "I checked the sensor data." "You read the sensor data. Reading it and knowing what the sensor can't measure, those are different skills." She said it without cruelty, but without softening either. That's not something that comes from hardware. It comes from a long time in field conditions where the hardware doesn't exist or doesn't work. He nodded slowly. "The apology is accepted," she said. "For what it's worth, the first 2 shots were clean. Your fundamentals are solid." He almost said something dismissive, a reflex. He caught it. "Thank you," he said instead, and he meant it in the uncomplicated way that people mean things when they've run out of the energy required to mean them partially. Mara nodded and went back to her notepad. She walked 3 steps, then stopped without turning around. The mounting rail failure on Units 2 and 3. You're leading the November exercise? Yes. Make sure the replacement rails are certified by someone who is trained on cumulative load tolerance, not just static rating. The maintenance team is good, but that's a gap in the base protocol. A pause. I flagged it in my report, but flag it again yourself. Redundancy matters. She walked away. She was reading her notepad before she turned the corner. Voss stood in the beige hallway with his cold coffee and thought about the fact that she had just helped him, and that she had done it without making it a lesson or a condition or a performance of generosity. She'd done it the way you hand someone information that they need because they need it, and then you move on. He thought about that for longer than he stood there. Bets. By the following morning, Voss's name was on a memo from Colonel Drummond's office. He read it at 06:15, standing at the counter in his quarters with coffee he hadn't touched. The memo cited the previous day's demonstration. It cited his conduct during the setup phase, the public comment, the manner in which it was made, the audience present, the professional context. It did not editorialize. It did not use words like arrogant or unprofessional. It used the word inappropriate and the phrase conduct unbecoming a demonstration leader and a specific reference to the section of military professionalism standards that covered treatment of civilian evaluators during joint operations. The memo did not remove him from active duty. It did remove him from the demonstration program, effective immediately, pending a conduct review and a formal assessment of his qualification to represent the training center's capabilities in joint evaluation settings. He read it twice. He put it down. He picked it up and read it a third time. He thought about contesting it. The thought lasted approximately 15 seconds before it dissolved, because contesting it would have required constructing a version of yesterday in which he had done nothing wrong, and he had run out of the energy for that construction sometime in the middle of his 45 minutes in the hallway. He signed the acknowledgement form. He put it in the outgoing file. He drank his coffee. The maintenance failure on Units 2 and 3 was confirmed by 0900. The cumulative load calculation, the one Mara had described at the bench, the one nobody had been running because the base protocol didn't require it, showed that Unit 2 was at 94% of its critical failure threshold, and Unit 3 was at 87%. Both were pulled from service immediately. The November exercise was suspended pending equipment review and protocol revision. The range supervisor, a master sergeant named Olufemi, spent most of that morning on the phone with the equipment manufacturer's technical division, whose representative confirmed the calculation methodology and was quiet for an uncomfortably long time before saying that he would flag this for their maintenance documentation team. The representative did not say it, but the implication was clear. This was a gap in the manufacturer's own protocol, not just the bases, and units at other installations were likely operating under the same incomplete standard. Olufemi filed his report at 1100. By 1300, Drummond had forwarded it to 3 separate offices, one of which was in Washington. By 1400, 2 phone calls had been made from that Washington office, one to the equipment manufacturer and one to a program manager at a different installation who asked a series of precise questions and then was quiet for a moment before saying, "How did this get flagged?" A visiting civilian evaluator caught it during a platform audit. "Which evaluator?" A pause. "Mara Whitmore." There was a silence on the line, then, "She still has an eye for it." "Better than that. She caught it in about 40 seconds. Another silence. "Where is she now?" "She's supposed to leave this afternoon." "Don't let her leave, M." Mara's rental car was in Lot C, same as when she arrived, and she was 15 minutes from heading to it when Drummond found her in the evaluation building's main corridor with her bag over her shoulder and her notepad, new pages filled, tucked under her arm. "Ms. Whitmore?" Drummond's voice was professional, but she was moving quickly, which was its own indicator. "I need to ask you to wait." Mara looked at her. "I have a flight." "I know, I'm sorry." Drummond did look sorry, in the specific way of someone who is delivering a complication to a person who has already done more than they were asked to do. "We've had a call from the program office in Washington. They want to speak with you before you go." "About?" "The rail failure finding and—" a small pause. "Your assessment of the ballistic doctrine gaps. I think they want to discuss the scope of what you flagged. Mara looked at the corridor. She looked at her bag. She set the bag down on the floor beside a bench that was bolted to the wall, which was the kind of move that means a decision has been made, and she sat down on the bench and said, "How long?" They said within the hour. "All right." Drummond exhaled. "Can I get you something? Coffee, water?" "I'm fine." Drummond left. Mara sat on the bench in the corridor with her notepad and opened it and continued writing. She had 3 more items she wanted to document from the afternoon evaluation before the details sharpened out of her memory, and she was going to use the hour. She wrote for 20 minutes before the door at the end of the corridor opened and a man came through it who was not from this installation. She could tell because he was wearing civilian clothes that were the specific kind of civilian clothes that military personnel wear when they are not in uniform. Dark slacks, a plain jacket, shoes that were comfortable and appropriate and completely unmemorable. He was carrying a tablet and a folder, and he was moving with the particular directed purpose of someone who has flown somewhere to have a specific conversation and intends to have it. He stopped when he saw her. He looked at her the way people sometimes do when they've been given a name and a context, and the reality is both what they expected and, in some less definable way, more. "Miss Whitmore." "Yes." He sat in the chair beside the bench. He didn't extend a hand immediately. He set his tablet and folder down first, which was an odd ordering that suggested he was thinking about something else. Then he looked at her. "I'm David Ferenczi. Program Office, Long Range Systems Division." He paused. "We need to talk about what you found." "Which part?" "Both parts." He opened the folder. "The rail failure is the immediate issue. We're running a check on 19 other installations right now, and the early numbers are—" He stopped, looked at the numbers on the page. "Not good." Mara said nothing. She waited. "Preliminary data is showing 8 installations with units in the high-risk range. 3 of them have exercises scheduled in the next 6 weeks. He turned the folder toward her. "We need to know if the tolerance protocol you described is the complete fix, or if there are other gaps in the maintenance chain we haven't identified." She took the folder. She read. She read carefully, not quickly, because quick reading of technical data is how things get missed. Ferenczi sat and did not rush her. She finished. She handed the folder back. "The tolerance protocol is the primary gap, but it's a symptom. The underlying problem is that the maintenance certification for this platform family doesn't include cumulative load training. Your inspectors are being certified on static tolerance, which is fine for the first few hundred rounds and increasingly inadequate after that." She paused. "You need to audit the certification curriculum, not just the protocol." Ferenczi was writing. "How long would a curriculum audit take?" "Done right, 3 weeks minimum. And done by someone who knows both the hardware and the doctrine." She said it evenly. "Yes." He looked at her. "General Wallace mentioned you might be open to a consulting engagement. He sent terms. I said I'd look at them. The scope has changed somewhat." Mara looked at him. "The rail failure is now a multi-installation issue. The doctrine gaps you identified yesterday, the crosswind methodology, the mounting calibration protocol, those affect every training center running this platform family." He set down his pen. "We're not talking about rewriting the qualification standard for Redstone. We're talking about a system-wide review." The corridor was quiet. Somewhere in the building, a phone was ringing and not being answered. "How many installations?" Mara asked. 23 domestic, 7 overseas." She looked at the folder in his hands. She looked at her notepad. She thought about her flight, which was in 3 hours and 40 minutes, and the rental car in Lot C, and the particular quality of quiet that existed in her house in New Mexico that she had been looking forward to on the drive from the airport this morning. "Send me the revised terms," she said. "We'd like an answer by—" "Send them tonight," she said. "I'll have an answer by morning." Ferenczi looked at her for a moment. "Tonight. Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "No, that works." He started to close the folder. Then he stopped. He looked at her again with the expression of someone who has been professionally precise all conversation and is about to be briefly human. "The shot yesterday," he said. The 3,200-meter hit. I watched the footage. Mara waited. The wind call you made? That gust cycle at the midpoint. Our modeling software doesn't capture that pattern. We've been trying to build a predictive algorithm for it for 2 years. A pause. How did you see it? She looked at him. The grass? She said. He blinked. I'm sorry? There's a grass line along the eastern berm. The gust cycle was visible in the movement pattern if you watched it long enough. She looked at him steadily. Your algorithm is trying to model the air. Watch what the air does to the ground. Ferenczi stared at her for a moment. Then he wrote that down too. The phone at the end of the corridor had stopped ringing. The building was quiet around them. Outside, the Arizona afternoon was moving toward the late-day light that turned the desert the color of old copper. And in Lot C, Mara's rental car was sitting in its space, going nowhere. She picked up her notepad and went back to writing. There were 19 installations running risk assessments right now. 3 exercises in 6 weeks. 23 domestic sites with the same incomplete certification curriculum. A doctrine written for hardware that no longer existed in its original form. And somewhere in Washington, someone had just asked to see the footage from Range 7 and was watching a woman who was supposed to be retired make a shot that their best modeling software couldn't predict, and beginning to understand that the retirement had been a very expensive mistake. Mara Whitmore filled the last 2 lines of her notepad page, turned it, and started on the next one. She was going to need more pages. She was going to need more pages. The revised terms arrived at 11:47 that night, which told her that Ferenczi had gone straight from the corridor to a phone and had not stopped moving since. Mara was in her hotel room 4 miles from the base. She'd missed the flight, rebooked for Thursday, eaten a sandwich she'd bought from a vending machine because the hotel restaurant had closed at 9. And she was sitting at the desk with the lamp on and the curtains open to the Arizona dark when her email notified her of the attachment. She opened it. She read it twice. The scope was what Ferenczi had described. 23 domestic installations, 7 overseas, full curriculum audit, doctrine revision for the current platform family, estimated engagement window of 16 weeks with a possible extension to 20. The compensation was serious. The clearance reinstatement would be temporary and tiered, sufficient for the access she'd need to review classified maintenance records and field data from operational deployments. She closed the laptop. She looked at the dark outside the window for a while. Not long. She wasn't a person who needed a long time to think when the thinking was already done, and she was just waiting to admit it. The decision had been made in the corridor when Ferenczi said 8 installations in the high-risk range and 3 exercises in 6 weeks. She had known it then. Everything after that was logistics. She opened the laptop and typed 4 sentences accepting the terms and requesting 1 modification. She wanted direct access to the field maintenance logs, not summaries, and she wanted it from day 1. Not after the administrative clearance process completed. She hit send. She closed the laptop. She went to sleep. Ferenczi replied at 6:14 in the morning. Direct access granted from day 1. Welcome back. She read it, set her phone face down on the desk, and went to take a shower. She had a lot of work to do, and she was not the kind of person who spent time on the feeling of a thing when the thing itself was waiting. The first 3 weeks were not glamorous. They were the kind of work that looks like paperwork from the outside, and is, in fact, the most important kind of structural thinking. Reading through maintenance logs for 23 installations with the specific attention of someone looking not for what the documents said, but for what the pattern of the documents revealed. Mara worked from a small office in the program division's Washington satellite facility, a building that smelled like recycled air and old coffee, and the particular institutional weariness of offices that have been important for a long time. She had a desk, a secure terminal, a whiteboard that she filled and erased and filled again, and a direct line to Ferenczi when she needed something, which was daily. What she found in the logs was worse than the preliminary data had suggested. Not catastrophically worse, but worse in the specific way of things that have been managed by people making locally reasonable decisions within a framework that has a systemic flaw. The individual pieces looked fine, or close enough to fine, that nobody had flagged them, but the pattern across the pieces revealed a failure of integrated thinking that had been building for 4 years. The cumulative load tolerance gap was the most dangerous manifestation, but it was not the only one. There was a calibration drift issue in the environmental sensor arrays that was being addressed at each installation as a local problem, never recognized as a common root cause. There was a documentation gap in the crosswind methodology that was producing inconsistency in how instructors taught the same material. There was a mounting hardware certification that referenced a torque specification from the previous generation of platforms and had never been updated. Mara documented all of it. She was thorough and she was fast, which is a combination that is rarer than it sounds, because thoroughness usually costs time, and she had learned over decades how to not let it. She sent Ferenczi daily summaries that were brief and specific and required follow-up, and he handled the follow-up and came back with questions, and they developed a working rhythm that was efficient and largely wordless in the way that good professional relationships often are. At Redstone, Derek Voss was 3 weeks into his conduct review. He had not contested the memo. He had submitted the acknowledgement form, attended the required meeting with Colonel Drummond, and answered the Conduct Review Board's questions with the particular deliberate honesty of a man who has decided that the version of himself that existed before a specific Tuesday in October is no longer a viable operating model. The board was not unkind. They were also not soft. They noted the public nature of the incident, the presence of general grade and foreign observers, the professional and institutional implications of dismissing a civilian evaluator of Mara Whitmore's standing in the manner in which Voss had done it. They also noted, and this was not nothing, that Voss had walked into a corridor and apologized to her without being told to, and that when she had given him information about the mounting rail, he had flagged it a second time independently, which had contributed to the speed of the installation-wide risk assessment, and that in the weeks since the incident, he had been, by all measurable indicators, doing his job well and not being an idiot about it. The board's decision came on a Wednesday. He was removed from the demonstration program for 60 days, required to complete a professional conduct course, and placed in a mentorship assignment for the duration of his removal. The mentorship assignment was with a senior marksmanship instructor named Sergeant Major Rourke, who was 63 years old, had seen everything twice, and communicated primarily through the sustained application of silence in the direction of people who were being foolish. Voss found this clarifying. He wrote a letter to Mara. It took him 3 drafts. The final version was 2 paragraphs, which was the right length for what it needed to say, and he sent it to the address Drummond gave him without rereading it a 4th time, because rereading it a 4th time would have been about him and not about her. She read it. She wrote a 4-sentence reply. She went back to work. 1. The crisis arrived in week 4, which is where crises tend to arrive. Not at the beginning when everyone is alert, and not at the end when the systems have been fixed, but in the specific window when people have begun to relax slightly and the work has not yet reached the point of resolution. It arrived as a phone call to Ferenczi at 7:23 in the morning, which he then brought to Mara at 7:41 in the form of his own face appearing in her office doorway, looking the way faces look when the number of bad variables has just increased faster than the available solutions. Kessler range, he said. Mara looked up from the log she was reading. Kessler was one of the 8 high-risk installations, not the highest rated, but in the upper group. They had been scheduled for rail inspection this week. What happened? They ran the inspection yesterday. Found the rail failure on 3 units, which we expected. The problem is, he came into the office and closed the door. While they were doing the inspection, the range supervisor pulled the maintenance logs for the full platform inventory, not just the rails, everything. She waited. There's a second issue. He set his tablet on her desk and turned it so she could see. Barrel erosion. It's being flagged at several units, and the erosion rate is higher than the manufacturer's projected curve. Mara looked at the data. She looked at it carefully. The barrel erosion numbers were not what she expected, not because they were too high, but because of the pattern. The erosion wasn't uniform across the units. It was clustered, which meant this was not a manufacturing variance issue. It was a usage pattern issue. Something specific about how these units were being operated was accelerating the erosion. When's their next live exercise? She asked. 6 days. She looked at the erosion data again. She knew what accelerated barrel erosion at this specific rate meant for a high-powered long-range platform. It meant that at some point in the operational cycle, The round would exit the barrel at a velocity and with a rotational stability that was measurably different from what the firing solution accounted for, and it would not announce this change. The shooter would not feel it. The miss would be attributed to other factors. Or, and this was the scenario she was holding in the front of her mind as she looked at the numbers, the barrel would fail under stress conditions, and the failure mode would not be a miss. "What's the cleaning protocol at Kessler?" she asked. Ferenczi pulled up another file. He read. He stopped reading. He looked at her. "They're using the old protocol, which specifies what solvent." He read. BR4. BR4 was discontinued 18 months ago. She said it flat. The replacement, BR7, has a different viscosity. If you use the old protocol with the new solvent, you're leaving a residue layer that traps heat at the chamber end of the barrel. A pause. Which accelerates erosion in exactly this pattern. Ferenczi put the tablet down. He looked at the wall for a moment. 18 months. The protocol was updated. The solvent was updated. Nobody connected them. He picked the tablet back up. "I need to get this to Kessler Range Command today. You need to get it to all 23 installations today." She was already turning to her whiteboard. "How many of them are still on the BR4 protocol?" He didn't know yet. He was going to find out. He left the office with his tablet and his phone and the expression of a man calculating how many calls he needed to make in the next 2 hours. And Mara turned to the whiteboard and wrote BR4/BR7, cross-reference at the top, and started mapping the protocol gap against the maintenance log she had read in the previous 3 weeks, looking for every installation where the combination of new solvent and old protocol could be producing the same erosion signature she had just seen in the Kessler data. She found 11. 11 installations with the same cleaning protocol mismatch. 11 sets of units with potentially compromised barrels, and in the middle of those 11, 3 installations with exercises scheduled in the next 6 days. She called Ferenczi. He picked up on the first ring. 11, she said. A pause. 11. 3 with exercises in 6 days. I'm sending you the list now. She sent it. She heard him breathing on the other end of the line in the specific way of someone reading data while staying on a phone call. Then, Kessler, Renfield, and Barton. Yes. Barton has a joint exercise. There are allied nation observers attending. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. I know. This is going to need to go up the chain. It already needed to go up the chain. This makes it urgent. A pause. Who's the program director above you? Stroman, Deputy Assistant Secretary level. Can you get to him directly? Today, yes. He'll want... Ferenczi stopped. He started again. He's going to want to know how we missed this for 18 months. That's the right question. She said it without edge. The answer is in the documentation chain. I can walk through it when he's ready. Ferenczi was quiet for a moment. How confident are you in the barrel failure risk? Worst case. She considered that. High enough that I wouldn't put people on those units without inspection. The erosion profile I'm seeing, if I ran a bore scope down those barrels right now and the residue layer is what I think it is, some of them are going to show compromised rifling. A pause. That's a catastrophic failure vector. Not likely on any given shot, but not acceptable odds when you're talking about a live exercise. No, Ferenczi said quietly. No, it's not. The call ended. Mara stood at the whiteboard for a moment, then sat down and pulled up the bore inspection procedure for the current platform family. She wanted to be precise about what the Kessler range supervisor should be looking for, and she was going to write it out in language that left no room for interpretation, because the instruction chain from her to Kessler went through at least 3 layers of bureaucracy, and each layer was an opportunity for a nuance to get dropped. She wrote for 40 minutes. What she produced was not a memo. It was a field procedure, step by step, written in the language of people who held the equipment rather than the language of people who managed the people who held it. She sent it to Ferenczi with a note. This goes to the range supervisors directly, not through the maintenance office. The maintenance office will route it correctly, and it will take 2 days. You don't have 2 days. Ferenczi replied in 6 minutes. Sending now. Maiden. The chain of calls that followed was not visible to Mara because she was not the one making them, but she could track its progress by the frequency with which Ferenczi appeared in her doorway, with updated information and the increasingly senior nature of the names he mentioned. Stroman was briefed by noon. A deputy program director at the Joint Training Command was briefed by 1400. By 1600, the 3 exercises scheduled in the next 6 days had been suspended pending bore inspection at all 3 installations. At Barton, the Allied nation observers were already on site. Their liaison officer was given a formal notification that the exercise was suspended for equipment safety review. The liaison officer asked questions that were professional and precise and indicated that he understood exactly what a suspension of this kind implied about the state of the equipment, and the Barton Range commander answered those questions with the particular careful honesty of a man who has been directed by his chain of command to be transparent and is doing so while also being aware of every implication of each word. The bore inspections began at Kessler at 1800 local time, which was 2000 in Washington, and Mara was still in her office. She was not waiting for the inspection results. She would get them when she got them, and there was nothing she could do to accelerate a bore inspection happening 1,400 miles away. She was working on the curriculum audit, because the curriculum audit was what she had been brought in to do, and the equipment safety crisis was, in a real sense, an output of the curriculum failures she was documenting. The cleaning protocol mismatch was not an accident. It was the product of a training chain that had not been updated to reflect changes in materials. And if you fix the immediate crisis without fixing the training chain, you would be back here in 18 months with a different version of the same problem. She was on page 37 of the audit when her secure terminal pinged. The bore inspection results from Kessler were preliminary, but they were enough. Of 8 units inspected, 3 showed measurable rifling compromise. 1 showed a residue buildup in the chamber that the inspector described as, and Ferenczi had transcribed this verbatim, significant. I wouldn't call it a question of if, I'd call it a question of when. Mara read the line twice. She thought about the exercise that had been scheduled at Kessler. She thought about the 43 soldiers who would have been on the firing line. She thought about the barrel that the inspector had described, and the word when, and what when meant on a live fire range with real people on it. She closed that email and sat very still for approximately 30 seconds. Then she opened a new document and started writing the full bore inspection and cleaning protocol correction, not just for Kessler, not just for the 3 critical installations, but for all 23 domestic sites. Because if 8 units at Kessler had shown signs of this, the distribution across the full inventory was a question of degree, not kind. She had been writing for 12 minutes when Ferenczi appeared in her doorway again, and his expression this time was different from all the previous versions. Not alarmed, not managing something. He looked the way people look when something they've been working to prevent has been confirmed as real, and the confirmation is both terrible and clarifying. Renfield, he said. She looked up. They finished their inspection. He came into the office. He didn't sit. 4 units. All 4 failed. She set her pen down. The range supervisor there, Castillo, ran the protocol exactly the way you wrote it, found the residue layer on all 4. He sent photos. Ferenczi's jaw worked once. He said, and I'm quoting, that one of those units was on his upcoming exercise demonstration list. He was going to use it to show the Allied observers a maximum range fire solution. A pause. He had 30 people scheduled to be within 40 meters of that barrel. The office was very quiet. How many of the 23 have completed inspection? Mara asked. 7. And the other 16? Working through the night. He looked at her. Stroman wants a full briefing in the morning, Joint Training Command Program Office, and, he paused, there will be a Senate Armed Services staffer in the room. This has gotten to the Hill. Mara looked at her document. She looked at the 37 pages of curriculum audit beside it. What time? She asked. 800. I'll be ready. Ferenczi nodded. He started to leave. He stopped in the doorway. Whitmore. He said it the way people say a name when they are about to say something that is not in the official category of things said in a workplace. This would have... He stopped, started again. If you hadn't caught the rail issue at Redstone, if the scope hadn't expanded, if we hadn't pulled all 23 installations into the audit, he looked at her, we wouldn't have known about the cleaning protocol. We wouldn't have run the bore inspections. And next week, don't, she said. Not unkindly. He looked at her. It's useful to understand the near miss, she said. It's not useful to stand in it. She picked up her pen. Kessler's 3 compromised units. Has the disposal protocol been initiated? He took a breath. Yes. And Renfield's 4? As of an hour ago. Good. She turned back to her document. I'll have the full bore correction protocol for the remaining 16 installations completed before midnight. Make sure it goes directly to the range supervisors. Yes. He paused one more beat in the doorway. Thank you. She had already started writing. The hallway outside her office was empty. The building was running on skeleton staff, the overnight security rotation, a duty officer, 2 people in the communications room who were managing the incoming inspection reports as they arrived from installations across time zones. Somewhere on the West Coast, a range supervisor named Alderman, not the PFC from Redstone, a different Alderman, the base being full of coincidences that weren't, was in the middle of an inspection on 4 units at his installation, working by flashlight because the range facility's overhead lighting had a short in the main circuit that maintenance had been scheduled to fix next week. He was on Unit 3 when he found it. He did not call Ferenczi. He called his own range commander, who called Ferenczi, who was in his car in the parking garage beneath the building when his phone rang, and he sat there in the dark for a moment before answering it. The Unit 3 barrel at Alderman's installation was not in the same category as the Renfield units. The rifling damage was not measurable degradation. It was structural. The breech end of the barrel had developed a fracture that ran along the grain of the metal in a way that was consistent with sustained thermal stress, exactly what the residue buildup caused. And exactly what happened when a barrel in that condition was fired was a question that no one at any of the 23 installations was going to answer empirically, because that was not a question you answered with a live round and people nearby. Alderman sent photos from his phone. They were not professional quality images. They were flashlight illuminated, slightly blurred, taken with the urgency of a man who wants documentation before he sends the information up the chain, and they were clear enough. Ferenczi forwarded them to Mara at 11:52. She opened them on her secure terminal. She looked at the fracture for a long time. Then she did the math. Not in writing, in her head, because the math was not complicated. 23 installations, 7 with completed inspections, 16 still in process. 3 confirmed structural failures so far in the units they had gotten to first. The ones they had gotten to first were the ones with the highest cumulative round counts and the most compressed inspection schedules. In other words, the best-case portion of the inventory. She opened Ferenczi's number on her phone. He picked up before the first ring finished, which meant he had been sitting with his phone in his hand. I need the projected completion time for the remaining 16 installations, she said. Current estimate is... She heard him checking something. 41 hours. That's too long. I know. They're moving as fast as... I know they are. She was looking at the photo on her screen, the fracture in the metal, the precise angle of it. Pull the inspection schedule. The 8 installations with the highest cumulative round count since the protocol change. Those go first. Tonight, if possible. I'll reorganize it. There's something else. She paused. She said it carefully because there was a way to say this that was useful and a way to say it that was alarming. And alarming was not what the situation needed at 11:52 at night. The fracture in Alderman's Unit 3. The profile is consistent with a specific failure mode. Thermal cycling fatigue at the breech end. That's not a gradual failure. It doesn't give you warning shots. A beat. If that barrel had been used in a demonstration, any demonstration, at any range, with anyone in the adjacent firing positions. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Ferenczi was quiet on the other end for exactly 4 seconds. I'll call Stroman, he said. Tell him we need to discuss whether the briefing scope expands tomorrow. The Senate staffer needs to understand what a structural barrel failure looks like in a demonstration context. He's not going to like that conversation. No, Mara said. He's not. She ended the call. She turned back to her terminal. The protocol correction document was at page 4. She had been interrupted by the inspection results, and now she turned back to it with the specific focused attention of someone who understands that the document she is writing is one of the most important things she has produced in her career, and that the stakes attached to it are not abstract. She wrote until 2 o'clock in the morning. She produced 11 pages of precise, step-by-step protocol that covered bore inspection, cleaning procedure, residue assessment, and the decision matrix for service, repair, and disposal of compromised units. She included diagrams drawn by hand on a pad beside her keyboard and photographed with her phone. She included the technical reference for BR7 viscosity properties and the mathematical relationship between those properties and barrel temperature at the chamber end under sustained fire. She included a section on documentation requirements that was, in her own assessment, probably excessive for an immediate crisis protocol and completely appropriate for a systemic training standard. At 2:14, she emailed the document to Forensi, flagged as urgent, with a note. For immediate distribution to all inspection teams still in the field. The decision matrix on pages 8 to 9 should be used in real time as units are inspected. Don't wait for the briefing. She shut her terminal down. She gathered her materials for the morning briefing, the 37 pages of curriculum audit, the maintenance log cross-reference, the inspection data summary that Forensi would have updated by 600. She put on her jacket. She picked up her bag. She stood for a moment in her office in the quiet building with the fluorescent lights and the whiteboard covered in her handwriting and looked at the list on the whiteboard of the 23 installations. 7 complete. 16 in progress. 8 of the 16, the high-priority ones, were being reorganized right now because she had called Forensi at midnight and told him to move them up. She thought about Renfield's 4 units and Kessler's 3, and Alderman's Unit 3 with its breech-end fracture, and the exercises that had been suspended, and the people who would have been on those firing lines. She thought about the morning briefing and the Senate staffer and Stroman, who was going to walk into a room tomorrow and learn that a systemic failure in his program's maintenance curriculum had produced at least 8 structurally compromised barrels across his installation network, and that this had been caught not by his program's internal review processes, but by a retired woman who had been brought in to evaluate a targeting software system and had, in the course of 4 weeks, uncovered a chain of interconnected failures that reached from the firing line to the certification curriculum to the documentation protocol to the supply chain transition that nobody had fully tracked. She turned off the light. She walked to the elevator. The building was quiet around her, the overnight rotation doing its rounds, the communications room still lit and busy with incoming inspection data from the West Coast installations where it was not yet midnight. She pressed the lobby button. The elevator moved. She looked at her reflection in the polished doors, silver-streaked hair, field jacket, the lines around her eyes. She looked like what she was. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. She walked out into the night air, which was cool and carried the particular smell of a city that was still technically awake even though most of its people were not. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. It was a message from the Barton installation, not Forensi. Not a program official. It was from the range commander directly, a colonel named Harwick, who had apparently gotten her secure contact from the inspection coordination channel, and his message was 3 sentences long. She read it. She stood on the sidewalk outside the building in the October night and read it twice. The 3rd sentence was this: Bore inspection of Unit 7 at Barton has been halted because the inspection supervisor found something that isn't in your protocol, requesting immediate guidance, as the Allied nation observers are still on site, and one of them has asked to examine the unit personally. She was already dialing before she finished the 3rd sentence. Harwick picked up on the 2nd ring. Tell me what they found, Mara said. She was still on the sidewalk. The night air was cold enough that her breath was faintly visible. Inspector pulled the barrel for bore scope, Harwick said. He was a man who spoke in compressed sentences when under pressure, which told her he was under significant pressure. Standard procedure per your protocol. But inside the chamber, there's a secondary marking. Stamped, not engraved. Small. Our inspector didn't recognize it, and neither do I. Describe it. 2 letters and a number. KV9. Positioned at the 6 o'clock position on the chamber wall, approximately 4 centimeters from the breech face. Mara was quiet for 3 seconds. The sidewalk was empty around her. A cab moved through the intersection at the end of the block, and its taillights disappeared. "That's a proof mark," she said. "A what?" "A manufacturer's proof mark. It indicates the barrel went through a secondary testing protocol before final assembly." She paused. KV9 is not a current proof designation. It was used by a subcontractor that was part of the platform's original manufacturing chain, discontinued from the supply contract approximately 6 years ago. Another pause. "How many units at Barton are showing that mark?" She heard Harwick check. "Inspector's looking now." "Oh wait, then 3 out of the 9 units inspected so far. Pull those 3 from the inventory immediately, and do not let anyone handle them until I get there." She was already moving, walking back toward the building's entrance. The KV9 mark means those barrels went through a compression test that was later found to produce microfracturing in the rifling lands under sustained thermal load. The subcontractor was removed from the supply chain because of it. Those barrels should not be in active service. The silence on Harwick's end had a specific weight to it. "They've been in active service for how long?" he asked. "That depends on when Barton received them. I need the acquisition records." She was back in the lobby, pressing the elevator button. The Allied observer who asked to examine the unit. "What's his background?" "He's their lead weapons systems analyst. Name's Koronen. He's been very quiet all day, which I'm told is not his usual manner." "Is he still on site?" "He's in the range office. He hasn't left." The elevator opened. She stepped in. "Tell him I'll speak with him when I arrive. Don't let him examine the unit without me present." "When are you— First flight I can get. Have the acquisition records and the full inventory log ready." She looked at her watch. It was 2:21 in the morning. "And Harwick, the Allied observers cannot go back to their delegation tonight with incomplete information. Whatever Koronen saw or suspects, we need to get ahead of it." "Understood." A beat. "Ms. Whitmore, is this as bad as it sounds?" She thought about the KV9 mark. She thought about the microfracturing it produced and the thermal load of a maximum range demonstration shot and the 30 people Harwick had mentioned standing within 40 meters. "Book me the conference room for 0900, she said. "We'll know more by then." Bye. The earliest flight to Barton got her there at 6:40 in the morning. She had slept 40 minutes on the plane, sitting upright with her jacket folded in her lap, and woken herself up at the beginning of descent with the practiced deficiency of someone who has learned to take sleep in whatever increment is available. Harwick sent a car. She read the acquisition records in transit. The KV9 barrels had entered Barton's inventory 22 months ago as part of a routine resupply order. The acquisition documentation listed the manufacturer as the primary contractor, which was accurate. What it did not list was the subcontractor origin of the specific barrel components, because the supply chain documentation at that tier was not required to trace component provenance beyond the primary contractor level. This was not fraud. It was a documentation gap. The primary contractor had not knowingly submitted substandard barrels. The subcontractor's components had entered the supply chain during a period when the quality control failure had not yet been formally identified, and by the time the subcontractor was removed from the contract, those components had already been assembled, tested at the primary level, and shipped. The testing had not caught the microfracturing because the primary testing protocol was not designed to detect it. The test that revealed the fracturing pattern had been developed after the subcontractor was removed, as part of the investigation into why they were removed. It was a retrospective discovery. Nobody had gone back and checked the barrels already in the field. Nobody, until a bore inspector at Barton, following a protocol written by Mara Whitmore at 2 in the morning, had pulled a barrel for inspection and found a proof mark he didn't recognize. She had the acquisition records memorized before the car reached the base gate. Harwick met her at the range office. He was a lean man in his early 50s with the permanent squint of someone who has spent a significant portion of his career outdoors in bright conditions, and he looked like he had not slept. He had the inventory log under his arm, and he handed it to her before they finished shaking hands, which she appreciated. "Korhonen's in the conference room," he said. "He's been there since 05:30. He asked for coffee and the inspection photos." "Did you give him the photos?" "I gave him coffee." "Good." She was walking and reading simultaneously, which she had been doing since approximately 1987. "The 3 KV9 units, where are they now?" Secured in the armory. Nobody's touched them since your call. Who else on your staff knows about the proof mark? My inspector, my range supervisor, and me. I've kept it contained. She stopped walking. She looked at him. Why? He met her eyes. Because Korhonen was in the room when my inspector found it, and Korhonen's face told me he recognized it before our inspector did. And I didn't know what that meant, so I stopped talking until I could talk to you. Mara looked at him for a moment. That was good instinct. Thank you. He said it without relief, because he wasn't sure yet whether his instinct had been fast enough. Korhonen was a tall man, late 40s, with the economical physicality of someone who had trained seriously for a long time and maintained it as a matter of professional identity rather than vanity. He stood when Mara came into the conference room, which was a reflex rather than a performance. He had the inspection photos spread on the table in front of him, not the photos Harwick had declined to share, but photos he had apparently taken himself with his own phone during the inspection, before anyone had thought to ask him not to. Mara looked at the photos. She looked at him. You've seen the KV-9 mark before, she said. It was not a question. Korhonen sat down. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a man deciding how much of what he knows is his to share and how much belongs to a chain of command that he would need to consult. Then he made a decision. We received the same supply batch, he said. Our acquisition came through the same primary contractor, same contract cycle, 20 months ago. He paused. We had a barrel failure in training 8 months ago, a demonstration shot, extended range. The failure mode was, he looked at the photo, consistent with what I'm seeing here. Mara sat down across from him. Was anyone injured? She asked. No, the shooter recognized the misfire signature and followed protocol. The barrel was pulled. He looked at her steadily. But we didn't know why it failed. We attributed it to a manufacturing defect in that specific unit and replaced it. We didn't trace the proof mark. Because you didn't know to look for it. No, we didn't. The conference room was quiet. Through the window, the Arizona morning was fully light now, the early sun hitting the range buildings with the flat brightness of high desert. Somewhere across the base, soldiers were starting their morning routines, running and drilling and doing all the things that soldiers do in the time before the work of the day becomes something specific and urgent. How many units in your inventory came from that supply batch? Mara asked. Korhonen looked at his phone. He had already checked. 11. Have any of them been inspected for the KV-9 mark? Not systematically, not until now. She nodded. You need to send your weapons division the bore inspection protocol I distributed last night. I'll flag the KV-9 section specifically. She paused. And you need to report your barrel failure from 8 months ago to your program office and to ours, formally. It's relevant data and it's been sitting in a gap. He looked at her. That report will create complications. It already has complications. The report just makes them documented. She said it without judgment. The 8-month-old failure, combined with what we're finding today, creates a timeline. That timeline is going to be part of the investigation. You're better off submitting it than having it discovered. He looked at the inspection photos for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and began composing a message. And Mara turned to the inventory log and started cross-referencing the Barton acquisition records against the supply chain documentation she had read in the car. They worked in parallel, in silence. In the early morning light of a conference room at an Arizona military installation, two people from different countries and different programs who had arrived at the same problem from opposite ends, and were now, practically if not officially, working it together. Harwick appeared in the doorway at 0820. He looked at the two of them at the table with a slight readjustment in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but the particular recalibration of a man who came in expecting tension and found something more useful. Program office is on the line, he said. Ferenczi and Stroman, both. Mara stood. Conference line or secure terminal? Secure terminal, room 3. She looked at Korhonen. Anything you want included in this briefing that you haven't already sent up your own chain? He considered. Tell them the 8-month timeline. I'm authorizing you to include it. She nodded and followed Harwick out. Tkom. Stroman was not a man who panicked, which was one of his genuine professional qualities. He was also not a man who accepted incomplete information as a substitute for a plan, which was another. When Mara walked through the situation, the KV-9 proof mark, the supply chain provenance, the Allied nations' parallel inventory exposure, the 8-month-old barrel failure that had not been reported to the Joint Program Office, he listened without interrupting, asked 3 precise questions, and was quiet for a moment that was not indecisive but deliberate. Then he said, "How many KV-9 barrels are we looking at across the full domestic inventory?" Unknown until inspections complete. Barton found 3 and 9 units. If the distribution is proportional across the supply batch, we could be looking at 30 to 40 units total. Another pause. And the Allied nations 11? Korhonen's initiating inspection today. The Senate staffer is already in the building, Stroman said. The briefing scope is going to need to expand. I know. This is going to become a procurement investigation. It already is. She said it evenly. The question is whether it becomes that on our terms or the committee's. A silence, then. What do you recommend? She had thought about this on the plane. Full disclosure to the Armed Services Committee today before any version of this reaches them through the Allied channel or through a leak. You frame it as a proactive safety identification and response, which it is, and you bring the documentation showing the timeline of discovery and action. The bore inspections, the exercise suspensions, the Allied notification. A pause. You also bring the documentation showing that the failure was traced through a curriculum audit that identified the cleaning protocol gap, because that's the chain of discovery that got us here. That audit was initiated because of an equipment evaluation at Redstone that escalated appropriately. That story is not a story of systemic failure covered up. It's a story of systemic failure caught by a civilian contractor who was supposed to be evaluating targeting software, Stroman said. Yes. Another silence. The committee is going to ask who authorized the scope expansion. General Wallace authorized it on the basis of findings at Redstone. The program office concurred. That's documented. She paused. I'd recommend having Wallace present for the briefing. He's in Arizona. He can be on a secure line. A beat. He should be on the line. He's the one who saw what needed to be seen at Redstone and acted on it. That matters for the committee narrative. Ferenczi's voice came in. He had been quiet on the line for most of this. She's right. Wallace authorized the scope expansion the day after the Redstone evaluation. That's in the record. Stroman said, "Get him on the line for 0900. He paused. Whitmore, the Allied observer. Korhonen, is he going to be a problem? No, she said. He's going to be cooperative. He has his own barrel failure to report, and he knows the right way to handle it. How do you know that? Because he was already composing the message when I left him. She looked at the wall of the terminal room. He's a professional. He recognized that sitting on the 8-month data was a liability, and he moved on it. All right. Stroman took a breath that was visible through the line in the way that breath sometimes is when someone is reorganizing the next several hours of their life in real time. I'll notify the committee chair's office. Ferenczi, get the documentation package ready. Everything from Redstone forward in chronological order. Already building it, Ferenczi said. The call ended. Mara sat in the terminal room for a moment. Outside, she could hear Harwick in the hallway, talking to his range supervisor about the armory access log. The morning was fully underway now. The base had the particular sound of an installation that is going about its normal operations while something abnormal is happening in one of its buildings. She thought about the 0900 briefing. She thought about Stroman and the Senate staffer and Wallace on a secure line from Arizona. She thought about the procurement investigation that was coming, not if, when, and the supply chain documentation that was going to have to be reconstructed across a 22-month acquisition cycle. Then she thought about something else, something she had noticed in the acquisition records in the car that she had set aside because she didn't have enough context yet to know what it meant. She went back to the inventory log. Alton. The 0900 briefing lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes. Stroman led it. Mara provided the technical foundation, the cleaning protocol gap, the bore inspection findings, the KV9 supply chain provenance, with the flat precision of someone presenting a structural analysis rather than a narrative. The Senate staffer, a woman named Okafor, who had been in the Armed Services Committee office for 11 years and had heard many briefings and had the particular quality of attention that distinguishes people who have been listening carefully for a long time, asked specific questions and wrote specific notes. Wallace was on the secure line from Redstone. He was present for the portions that concerned him and spoke when he was asked to speak, which was about the sequence of decisions that had expanded the scope from a targeting software evaluation to a full platform audit. He was clear and precise and offered no editorializing about what the findings implied about the program's prior oversight, which was the right instinct because the findings implied plenty and did not need narration. When the briefing concluded, Okafor looked at Mara and said, "You've been a civilian contractor for 4 weeks." Roughly, yes. And in 4 weeks you identified a cleaning protocol failure, a cumulative load tolerance gap, a supply chain contamination, and an unreported barrel failure in an allied nation's inventory. The allied failure was reported to me, not discovered by me. Okafor's expression suggested she was not particularly interested in that distinction. The committee will have questions about how these gaps existed for 18 months in a program with a functioning oversight structure. That's the right question, Mara said. The curriculum audit I've been doing will provide part of the answer. The procurement investigation will provide the rest. You're recommending a procurement investigation. I'm describing what's necessary. The KV9 barrel provenance needs to be traced from the subcontractor level through every supply batch that was active during the period when those components were in the manufacturing chain. That's not a question I can answer from maintenance logs. Okafor wrote something. The committee will want your full report, not just the technical findings, the full documentation of the audit process and methodology. You'll have it. After Okafor left, Stroman remained on the line. He waited until the room was just him and Mara and Ferenczi before he spoke. The procurement investigation is going to move fast, he said. Once the committee gets the documentation, they'll have subpoena authority within days. I know. There are going to be people in this building who are not happy about that. She looked at the wall. Were they happy about the barrels? A silence. No, Stroman said. No, they were not. The procurement investigation was formally opened 6 days later. It moved, as Stroman had predicted, quickly. The supply chain documentation was subpoenaed from the primary contractor within the first week. The subcontractor records came 2 days after that, through a process that was neither smooth nor cooperative, but was ultimately not resistible, given the combined weight of the committee's authority and the physical evidence of 9 compromised barrels across 5 installations. What the documentation revealed was not criminal, exactly, but it was the kind of thing that is worse than criminal in certain professional contexts. It was negligent in a way that had been visible to people who had chosen not to see it. The subcontractor's quality control data showed that the microfracturing problem had been identified internally 6 months before the supply contract was terminated. For those 6 months, the subcontractor had continued shipping components, while their internal QC team worked on a fix. The primary contractor had been notified of the QC issue in summary form, a document flagging a manufacturing variance under review, and had assessed it as within acceptable parameters without conducting an independent evaluation. The man who had signed that assessment was a senior quality director at the primary contractor named Pollard. He had been in that role for 11 years. He had signed the variance assessment in a 40-minute window on a day when he had 7 other documents on his desk, and he had not requested the underlying data that would have told him what the variance actually meant under thermal load conditions. He was not a villain. He was a man who had made a fast, wrong decision in a system that did not adequately penalize fast, wrong decisions, and who had then moved on to the next document and the next until 8 months ago when a barrel failed at an Allied nation training range and nobody connected it to the thing he had signed 4 years prior. When the committee investigator interviewed him, he answered every question accurately and completely. He looked like a man who had been carrying something for 4 years without knowing exactly what it was, and now that he knew, the weight of it was very specific and very clear. He resigned the day after the interview. It was not requested. It was not required. He submitted it because the alternative, remaining in the role while the investigation proceeded, was something he could not reconcile with the self-assessment that he had apparently been revising for some time. The committee's preliminary findings named 3 additional individuals in the quality oversight chain whose decisions had contributed to the documentation failure. 2 were with the primary contractor. One was a program office manager named Theus, who had received the variance assessment summary and had forwarded it to his director with a note that read, essentially, that the contractor had reviewed it and found it acceptable. Theus had not reviewed it himself. He had forwarded a summary of a summary and called it oversight. Theus's director, when she saw Theus's note in the documentation chain, called him into her office and closed the door, and the conversation that followed was not recorded, but its outcome was visible in the reassignment notice that appeared in the program office directory 2 days later. None of this was Mara's work exactly. She had found the problem. The system, imperfect, slow, occasionally infuriating, and ultimately functional, was doing what systems do when they are shown a clear enough picture of their own failure. She was aware of the investigation's progress through Forensi, who kept her informed because she was still in the middle of the curriculum audit, and the findings were relevant to the section she was writing on procurement documentation requirements. She read the updates. She noted them. She went back to the audit. At Redstone, Derek Voss finished his professional conduct course on a Thursday afternoon and reported to Sergeant Major Rourke's office the following Monday morning to begin the second phase of his mentorship assignment. Rourke looked at him for a long time without saying anything, which was Rourke's standard opening methodology, and then said, "You know what you did wrong." "Yes," Voss said. "Do you know why you did it?" A pause. "I think so." "You think so isn't good enough for me." Rourke leaned back in his chair. "Come back when it's yes." Voss came back the following Wednesday and said yes, and meant it, and Rourke looked at him for another long moment and said, "All right, let's start." What they started was not remedial training. It was the kind of conversation-based instruction that does not have a curriculum, the kind where an older professional sits with a younger one and talks through specific decisions and specific moments and asks questions like, what did you know at that point and what did you assume, and what's the difference between those two things until the younger professional develops the habit of distinguishing between them. It was slow. It was uncomfortable in the way that accurate self-examination is uncomfortable. It was the most useful thing that had happened to Voss's professional development in 3 years. He wrote Mara a second letter at the end of the second week. It was shorter than the first. It said, "I understand now what I didn't know I was missing. Thank you for not making it harder than it needed to be." She read it during a lunch break between sections of the curriculum audit. She wrote a reply that was 2 sentences, then she went back to work. The curriculum audit was completed on a Friday, 51 days after Mara had arrived in Washington. It ran to 119 pages and covered every element of the long-range qualification standard, cross-referenced against the current platform family's technical specifications, the maintenance certification requirements, the cleaning and storage protocols, and the documentation chain. It identified 6 distinct gaps and proposed specific revisions for each. It included a new section on cumulative load tolerance that did not exist in the current standard. It included a revised cleaning protocol that reflected the transition from BR4 to BR7. It included a procurement documentation requirement that mandated component-level provenance tracking for barrel assemblies, a requirement that did not currently exist and that, had it existed 4 years ago, would have flagged the KV9 subcontractor components before they entered the active inventory. Mara submitted it to Forensi on a Friday afternoon with a cover note that said, "This is the full document. The 6 gap sections will need to be reviewed by current field instructors before implementation. I've noted the review recommendations for each. The procurement documentation section will need legal review for contractor requirement language. The timeline for full implementation should be realistic, not optimistic. I'd suggest 18 months for domestic installations, 24 for overseas." Forensi read it over the weekend. On Monday morning, he came into her office and set it on her desk. He had marked 12 places with small tabs. "These 12 sections," he said, "are going to change how we train every long-range marksman in this program for the next decade." She looked at the tabs. "Maybe longer." "Maybe longer," he agreed. He left. She looked at the document on her desk. 119 pages, 51 days of work, 4 weeks of prior findings that had made the work possible. She thought about the 9 barrels. She thought about the exercises that had been suspended. She thought about Korhunen's 8-month-old barrel failure and the shooter who had recognized the misfire signature and followed protocol and walked away. She thought about the grass line along the eastern berm at Redstone and the gust cycle running every 40 seconds and the specific moment when the conditions aligned and she'd known it was time. She picked up the document. She put it in her bag. She had one more thing to do before she left for the day, and it was in the building's main conference room, where Stroman had asked her to attend a program review meeting that she had been told was routine and she was fairly certain was not. She walked to the elevator. She pressed the button. She looked at her reflection in the polished doors and noticed that she looked tired, which was accurate, and that she also looked like someone who had finished something, which was also accurate. The elevator opened. Inside, standing against the back wall with a folder under his arm and an expression that was carefully professional and only slightly failing to conceal something larger underneath it, was a man she had not seen in 4 years. He was in uniform, full dress, decorations in order, the particular formal presentation of someone who is attending something official. She looked at him. He was the Deputy Chief of Staff for Programs. His name was Lieutenant General Harold Osei. She had last seen him at her retirement ceremony 4 years ago, when he had shaken her hand and said something about distinguished service that she had accepted politely and then driven away from in a car she had rented because she didn't own one in that city and she had been ready to leave. He looked at her now with the expression of a man who has read a 119-page curriculum audit and a procurement investigation timeline and a series of bore inspection reports, and who has a meeting to attend that he has been thinking about for 2 weeks. "Mara," he said. And then, after a pause that carried 4 years in it, "I owe you a conversation." The elevator doors began to close behind her. The elevator doors closed behind her with a sound that was very small and very final. Osei looked older than she remembered. Not in a way that was surprising. 4 years was 4 years. But in the specific way of men who have been carrying institutional weight for long enough that it has settled into the structure of their face. He had more gray at his temples. The lines around his eyes were deeper. He was still the same man who had stood at her retirement ceremony and said distinguished service in the particular tone of someone reciting a category rather than describing a person. And she had driven away from it in a rental car without looking back. She had not looked back. "Harold," she said. The elevator moved. Neither of them had pressed a button, which meant the conference room meeting had been a construction, something designed to put her in this specific space at this specific time. She recognized the architecture of it. She was not angry about it. She was simply noting it. "The audit," he said. "I read all of it. I know. The bore inspection findings, the procurement chain, the KV9 provenance." He looked at the folder under his arm as though checking that it was still there. "I've been reading your work for 6 weeks, not summaries, the actual documents." She waited. "I should have read your work 4 years ago," he said, "before the retirement board convened." The elevator reached the floor. The doors opened to an empty corridor. Neither of them moved immediately. "The board's decision was procedurally sound," Mara said. "The board's decision was procedurally sound and substantively wrong." He said it with the flatness of a man who has rehearsed something difficult until the emotion has been compressed out of the words, and only the meaning remains. "You were passed over for the senior instructor position because Henrik's assessment characterized your methodology as non-doctrinal. That assessment was presented to the board as authoritative. It wasn't contested." Colonel Henrik. She hadn't heard that name in 4 years and was mildly surprised by how little it moved through her. He had been the evaluation officer who had reviewed her curriculum proposals in the final year of her service, a meticulous, politically careful man who had read her revised long-range qualification standard, found it difficult to categorize within the existing framework, and written an assessment that described it as outside established doctrine in a tone that sounded like a problem rather than an innovation. "Henrik believed what he wrote," she said. "He believed it in the way that comfortable people believe things that don't require them to change anything." Osei finally stepped out of the elevator. She followed. The corridor was empty, It was a Friday evening, and the building's population had thinned. His assessment went into your file, and the board read it, and you retired as an instructor instead of as a curriculum architect, which is what you actually were. She walked beside him. The corridor was long, and the light at this end of the building was yellower than the light she'd been working under for 6 weeks, and it gave everything a slightly warmer quality than the conversation warranted. What happened to Henrik, she asked, not because she particularly needed to know, because it was the next logical question. He retired 8 months after you did, quietly. He'd been in the role for 12 years, and the transition was… Osei paused. He wasn't replaced with someone who understood what he'd missed. That's the part that cost us. They reached the end of the corridor. There was a window there, looking out over the building's rear courtyard, which was concrete and unremarkable and empty at this hour. Osei stopped. He turned to face her. The doctrine you wrote, the revised standard, it was implemented in a limited capacity at 2 installations, he said, informally. Instructors who had worked with you brought it in through the back door because the formal curriculum hadn't adopted it. I know, I found their fingerprints in the field data during the audit. Something moved across his face, not quite pain, the recognition of a specific kind of waste. The installations that adopted it informally showed a 17% improvement in long-range qualification rates over the cohorts that didn't. She looked out the window at the empty courtyard. I know that too, she said. It's in the audit, Section 4. He was quiet for a moment. I owe you an apology that's overdue by 4 years. You're giving it now. That's not the same as giving it when it would have mattered. She looked at him. He was right, and he knew it. And she was not going to tell him otherwise because telling him otherwise would be a kindness he hadn't earned and didn't need. What he needed was for her to receive what he was saying accurately, which meant receiving it without diminishing it and without inflating it either. No, she said. It's not the same, but it's what exists. She paused. What are you here to ask me? He opened the folder. Inside was a document she hadn't seen before, not her audit, not the investigation findings, something new. She read the header. She read the first paragraph. She looked up at him. This is a program directorship, she said. Long-range systems, doctrine, and curriculum. New position. Created from the investigation findings, specifically the committee's recommendation that the program establish dedicated curriculum oversight that doesn't sit underneath the procurement chain. He held her gaze. The curriculum function was embedded in the acquisition office. That's part of why the protocol gaps went unaddressed. They fell between procurement's responsibility and operations responsibility, and nobody owned them. I know. It's in the audit, Section 7. The new directorship owns them. He put the folder in her hands. It's a civilian senior executive position. Full authority over doctrine development, curriculum approval, and maintenance protocol standards across all domestic and overseas installations. Direct reporting line to the Deputy Chief of Staff level. He paused. To me. She looked at the document. She looked at it the way she had looked at the rifle at Redstone on a Tuesday morning in October. Not impressed, not alarmed, reading it. This was Stroman's recommendation, she asked. Stroman's, Ferenczi's, Wallace's, and the committee chairs. A pause. And mine. She turned the page. The scope was exactly what he'd described. Real authority, not advisory. The kind of structural position that could actually prevent what she had spent 6 weeks tracing the consequences of. The kind of role that existed, until now, only in the negative space of everything that had gone wrong. She turned another page. I need to think about it, she said. He nodded. He had expected this. How long? A week. You'll have it. She closed the folder. She held it at her side. They stood in the yellow-lit corridor for a moment, 2 people at the end of a long professional reckoning, and the unremarkable courtyard outside the window was doing nothing except existing in the late afternoon light, which was doing nothing except falling. Henrik's assessment, she said. It's still in my file. It's being reviewed, formally. The board's decision can't be retroactively changed. Your retirement stands as it was, but the record can be amended with a supplemental assessment that reflects the actual evaluation of your work. He paused. It's a bureaucratic fix for a bureaucratic wrong. I know that's not nothing, and I know it's not enough. It's accurate, she said. That's what matters. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was not pity. She would have ended the conversation if it had been pity, but something closer to the recognition that comes when you have spent time understanding what someone actually did and you arrive at the full scale of it. "You could have been bitter about this," he said. She considered that. "I was for a while. The first year." She looked at the folder in her hand. "Then I had other things to think about." He almost smiled. "New Mexico. It's quiet there. Is it enough?" She looked at him. It was a real question, not a rhetorical one, and it deserved a real answer. "It was becoming enough," she said. "Then Ferenczi sent me the terms." She walked back toward the elevator. He walked beside her. The building was very quiet around them, the end-of-week quiet of a place that holds significant work and significant consequence, and is, for a few hours, simply a building. She took the week. She drove back to New Mexico on the Saturday, which was a 13-hour drive that she split across 2 days, stopping overnight in a town whose name she forgot by the time she reached home. She walked through her house, which smelled like closed rooms and the particular settled quiet of a place that has been waiting without urgency. She sat on the back porch in the cold November air and drank coffee and looked at the mountains, which were the same mountains they had always been, unconcerned, enduring, indifferent to the questions of the people below them in the useful way that large things are indifferent. She thought about the 9 barrels. She thought about the 43 soldiers who would have been on the firing line at the November exercise. She thought about Korhonen's shooter, 8 months ago, who had recognized the misfire signature and followed protocol and gone home. She thought about the 17% improvement at the 2 installations that had adopted her curriculum informally through the back door, because the instructors who understood it had carried it forward in the absence of official recognition. She thought about the next group of instructors, the ones who were being trained right now under a standard that still had 6 documented gaps that she had identified and her audit had named and the new directorship was designed to address. She thought about what it meant to be the person who knew where the gaps were. On the 3rd day, she called Ferenczi. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then, "I'll send you the paperwork Monday." "Send it today." "I want to start the implementation timeline this week." A pause. "It's Saturday." "I know what day it is." He sent it in an hour. She read it on her laptop at the kitchen table with the mountains visible through the window and the coffee going cold beside her, and she made 3 notations in the margins for the onboarding discussion and emailed them back before the afternoon was gone. The program review hearing before the Armed Services Committee convened on a Tuesday in December, 6 weeks after the investigation formally opened. It was not a public hearing, it was a closed session, which meant the room contained only the committee members, their staffers, the program officials, and the witnesses. But closed sessions have their own kind of exposure, the kind that moves through institutional channels rather than public ones and arrives at the same places eventually. Stroman testified first. He presented the timeline of discovery, the Redstone evaluation, the scope expansion, the cleaning protocol finding, the bore inspections, the KV-9 provenance, clearly and without evasion. He acknowledged the systemic oversight gaps. He described the corrective actions. He did not minimize and he did not perform contrition. He didn't have, which is its own form of credibility. Mara testified second. She answered every question directly and technically and without editorializing about what the committee should conclude from the evidence. She had learned, over decades, that the most powerful form of testimony is the kind that lets the facts carry the argument, because facts that need to be amplified by the person presenting them are facts that are not quite strong enough on their own. Hers were strong enough. Okafor, the committee staffer who had sat in the Barton briefing room 6 weeks prior, watched Mara testify with the expression of a person who is watching something confirm itself. She asked 4 questions. They were the 4 most precise questions in the session. The primary contractor's quality director, the one who had replaced Pollard after his resignation, testified that the KV-9 barrel provenance had been traced to a supply batch of 237 components, produced during the 6-month window when the subcontractor's QC data showed the fracturing issue was known internally. Of those components, 94 had entered the active inventory of domestic and allied installations. Of the 94, 61 had been inspected. 11 showed measurable rifling compromise. 3 showed structural fracturing. The remaining 33 were still being located. The committee chair asked how it was possible that a subcontractor could internally identify a manufacturing defect, continue production for 6 months, and have that information exist only in summary form at the primary contractor level. The new quality director said it was the result of a documentation standard that prioritized supplier self-certification over independent verification, and that the standard was being revised. The committee chair said that the standard revision had been recommended in a previous audit 7 years ago and asked why it had not been implemented at that time. The new quality director said he did not know because that decision had been made before his tenure, and he meant it in the straightforward sense of not knowing rather than the defensive sense of not knowing. And this distinction was visible and noted. The hearing ended at 16:47. The committee chair said that the preliminary findings would be published within 30 days and that the committee expected to see implementation progress reports on a quarterly basis beginning in the spring. In the corridor afterward, Ferenczi fell into step beside Mara. He did not say anything for the first 20 seconds of walking, which was the specific silence of someone processing something that has just been concluded after a long period of unresolution. Then he said, "How are you feeling?" She considered the question seriously because it was asked seriously. "Like there's a lot of work to do," she said. He almost laughed. It was the right answer, not because it was stoic or deflecting, but because it was accurate. There was a lot of work to do. The doctrine revision, the curriculum implementation, the 33 unlocated barrels, the procurement documentation standard, the certification curriculum for the full platform family. The new directorship's first 18 months were already outlined in a document she had drafted on the flight to Washington, and the outline was dense. "The committee's going to publish the timeline," Ferenczi said. "When they do, some of what happened at Redstone is going to be part of the public record. The shot. The evaluation. I know. There's going to be press interest. There's always press interest. It doesn't change the work." He nodded. They reached the building's main entrance. Outside, the December air in Washington had the particular damp cold of a city built on a river, and the afternoon light was already going gray at the edges. "One more thing," Ferenczi said. He reached into his briefcase. He handed her a printed document, a single page, not official letterhead, formatted as a certificate of record amendment. At the top of the page, in the formal language of bureaucratic correction, it stated that the evaluation assessment filed by Colonel Raymond Henrick in the matter of Senior Instructor Whitmore's curriculum review was being supplemented by a formal record amendment reflecting the subsequent adoption and performance data of the methodologies under review. At the bottom, it bore Ose's signature and a date from the previous week. She read it. The language was exactly as Ose had described. A bureaucratic fix for a bureaucratic wrong, accurate if insufficient, which is the best that bureaucratic fixes are ever going to be. She folded it and put it in her jacket pocket. "Thank you," she said. Ose signed it himself. He could have delegated. "I know." She looked at the gray December sky above the building's entrance. He's the kind of man who knows the difference between delegating and abdicating. A pause. He should have known it 4 years ago, but he knows it now. She walked out into the cold. Bab. At Redstone, on a Thursday in January, Derek Voss stood at the front of a classroom containing 14 soldiers in their first week of long-range marksmanship qualification training. He was not leading the demonstration program. He was back in the classroom, which was where Sergeant Major Rourke had told him to start. Because the classroom was where assumptions get built. And if you are going to change what a soldier assumes, you change it before the rifle is in their hands. He had been given the new curriculum. Mara's revised standard, formally adopted and distributed to all domestic installations on December 19th, 2 weeks after the committee hearing. He had read it 4 times. He had made notes. He had brought his notes to Rourke, who had read them without comment and handed them back and said, "Teach it the way it's written, not the way you would have written it." He was teaching it the way it was written. He stood in front of the classroom with the new doctrine open on the table beside him, and he looked at the 14 soldiers, young, attentive, carrying the specific focused alertness of people who know they are about to learn something that will matter, and he said, "Before we talk about the rifle, we're going to talk about what the rifle can't tell you." He had thought about that opening line for 2 weeks. He had found it in Mara's curriculum. In the Introduction to the Crosswind Methodology section, the instrument measures the data. The marksman interprets the conditions the data cannot capture. He had not quoted it. He had translated it into something he could say in his own voice, to soldiers who were not yet sure what they didn't know, which was itself the lesson, the one he was still learning, in the methodical, uncomfortable way that real lessons are learned, without the grace of sudden revelation and without the certainty that you have arrived. He had not arrived. He was clear on that. He was somewhere in the middle of a long process of becoming a better version of a person who had been wrong in ways that had mattered, and the becoming was neither comfortable nor complete. But he was doing it. He was in the room. He was teaching the curriculum, and the curriculum was right, and that was enough for today. The spent casing from the 3,200-meter shot at Redstone found its way to a display case by a route that was more bureaucratic than ceremonial. Graves, the specialist who had watched it eject onto the concrete pad on that October morning, had picked it up almost without thinking and put it in his cargo pocket, and carried it for 3 weeks before he mentioned it to his squad supervisor, who mentioned it to a lieutenant who brought it to Sergeant Major Rourke as a curiosity, and Rourke had held it for a moment and looked at it and said, "Put it somewhere people can see it." The case was in the hallway outside the long-range qualification classroom at Redstone. It was a simple acrylic display, not commission, not official, assembled by Graves and a specialist named Tran who had heard the story secondhand and felt, for reasons she couldn't fully articulate, that it should be visible. Inside was the casing, and beneath it, a card that Graves had typed and printed on office paper and cut with scissors because he didn't have anything better. The card read, 3,200 meters, October. The person holding the rifle knew what the sensors couldn't measure. Pay attention to what the equipment doesn't show you. It did not say Mara's name. Graves had thought about that. He had decided, finally, that the name was in the record, in the evaluation report, in the committee findings, in the curriculum that was now the standard for every marksman in the program. The casing didn't need to explain itself. The people who walked past it and asked what it was would be told, and the telling was its own kind of record. On a February morning, Mara drove from Albuquerque to a training installation in southern New Mexico, where a group of 22 qualification candidates were 3 weeks into the new curriculum, and their lead instructor had asked her to observe a live fire evaluation. She was not there as an evaluator. She was there as the directorship's first field review, a structured observation that would inform the curriculum's first quarterly revision. There was paperwork involved. There was a report she would write afterward. None of that was why she had agreed to drive instead of fly. She parked in the visitor lot and walked to the range in the early morning cold, and the desert was the particular gray gold of February light before the sun fully commits, and the air smelled like dust and creosote and the cold metal smell of a range before the first shot goes. She stood at the observation position and watched the 22 candidates at the firing line. They were working through the crosswind methodology, the revised version, the section that had not existed in the standard 18 months ago, and their lead instructor was walking the line in the way of a good instructor who is present without crowding, available without hovering. She watched them work. They were not perfect. One candidate was rushing his wind read. Another was compensating too far left on a consistent basis that suggested a flinch pattern they hadn't identified yet. A third was performing well technically, but rushing his reset between shots in a way that was burning unnecessary time and would compound under pressure. These were the things that the curriculum, however good, could not fix on its own. The curriculum gave them the framework. The range gave them the repetition. What closed the distance between framework and instinct was time and attention, and the specific kind of instruction that asked the right questions at the right moment. That was the work, not the shot. The work was everything that made the shot possible. She had known this for 40 years. She had built her career on it. The unglamorous, load-bearing infrastructure of knowing how things work before they fail, and caring about that knowledge enough to write it down and protect it, even when the people with the authority to act on it were looking at something shinier. She had been dismissed for it. She had been written off as non-doctrinal and retired into the particular quiet of people who know things that their institutions have chosen not to use. She had spent 4 years in New Mexico becoming something that was not quite peace and not quite resignation, and was, in fact, she could see now, just the accumulation of time in which she had not stopped being herself. And then a targeting software evaluation had put her on a range on a Tuesday morning in October, and a sergeant with a good technical foundation and a bad habit of assumption had handed her an opening she had not been looking for, and she had taken the shot. Not to prove something. She hadn't been trying to prove anything. She had been trying to solve the problem in front of her, which was what she had always done, which was the only thing she had ever really known how to do. The candidate on the far left of the firing line, a young woman named Sato, who had the best natural wind read in the group and the most inconsistent trigger discipline, settled into her firing position and went still in the particular way of a person whose attention has narrowed to a single point. She read the conditions. She made the adjustment. She fired. The impact data appeared. Hit, center. Deviation 0.07 meters. Not 0.04. Not perfect, but clean and true and earned. Mara watched the young woman reset her position and begin reading the conditions for the next shot, not celebrating, not pausing to register what she'd done. Just moving forward into the next problem, which was the only way the work got done. Something in Mara's chest shifted. Not sentiment. She had spent too long around real stakes to confuse sentiment with meaning. What she felt was the specific, grounded satisfaction of seeing something work, of having built the framework that the young woman on the firing line was now operating inside and watching it hold. This was what the record amendment didn't capture, what the display case in the hallway at Redstone couldn't say, what the committee findings named only in the aggregate, in numbers and percentages and corrective action timelines. It was the fact that competence, real competence, the kind built over decades of attention and failure and revision, does not announce itself. It does not need an audience to be real. It exists in the work, and in the people who carry the work forward, and in the specific moment when a young woman on a firing line in February goes still and reads the wind and fires and hits, and doesn't know yet that the methodology she is using was written by someone who was told it was outside established doctrine. She would know eventually. It was in the curriculum, in the introduction to the crosswind section, where the author credit had been restored as part of the record amendment process. She would read it someday, or an instructor would tell her, or she would find it in a reference that pointed back. But that was later. Right now, the 22 candidates were working through their evaluation in the February light, and Mara was watching, and the desert was doing what deserts do, holding still, enduring, offering conditions that were neither fair nor unfair, simply real. She took out her notepad and began writing her observations. The work was not finished. It was never finished. That was the part that nobody who watched the shot on the display case story understood. The shot was a moment, a visible point of proof, and proof was necessary, but not sufficient. What came after the proof was the structure that made the proof matter beyond the moment. She was building that structure. She had always been building it. The 4 years in New Mexico had not stopped the building. They had just made it invisible, which was not the same thing as absent. She wrote for 20 minutes. She filled 4 pages. She looked up at the firing line and watched the candidate named Sato settle into her position again, going still in that particular way. And she thought about the grass along the eastern berm at Redstone, and the gust cycle running every 40 seconds, and the specific alignment of conditions that told her it was time. Not every shot gives you that alignment. Most conditions are imperfect, most windows are narrow, and most of the discipline is in the waiting, in knowing the difference between the moment that looks right and the moment that is right, and having enough patience and enough knowledge to tell them apart. She had spent her whole career learning that difference. She had a long time yet to teach it. Sato fired. The impact data appeared. Hit. Center. Mara wrote it down and moved to the next observation.